Hello and welcome to Beyond Boundaries. I'm Justin Douglas. So happy you can join me for this episode of Beyond Boundaries. Please consider checking out the Patreon page and supporting the Beyond Boundaries podcast if you're able. That's patreon.com/Beyond Boundaries podcast. You can also help by sharing, subscribing, rating, and reviewing the podcast. It makes a huge difference. Hope you enjoy this episode of Beyond Boundaries. So today I had the great opportunity to interview one of my former students, Shannon Rosedale, and this happens over a phone call. So it'll be maybe a little less quality than what you're used to on this particular podcast, as we didn't have all the mics out face-to-face in person, but man, the conversation is so good. I was just incredibly blessed by the conversation, and also just like talking to a former student who's doing what I believe is such important work, and just so educated on it too. Super proud of her and super excited for you to get this episode and check it out. So here it is, my conversation with Shannon Rosedale. All right, so I'm here with Shannon Rosedale, and Shannon occupies a unique, reality for like our connectedness. She's a former student in my youth group way back in the day. Shannon's like a full-fledged adult now, but like, I think 15 or 16-year-old Shannon, would that have been around the time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's crazy to think back to those days, and even think about like how different of a person I am now from when I was your youth pastor. That was like the first full-time youth pastor job I had. So I'm confident I made all kinds of mistakes. No, we weren't married yet. We got married. Brittany and I got married while we were there at that church. So like, it's just wild to even think back and be like, wow, I wonder what Shannon like thinks of me and all of the like ways I was a pastor then. And then like, I don't know, it's just funny as a youth pastor to think about that. But we've stayed connected via just like social media here and there. And I know you've been doing some really interesting work in Texas. And I guess I just wanted to talk a little bit about your work. You had actually made a Facebook post that made me reach out to you and just kind of want to know a little bit about the work you were doing. So maybe the first thing you can do is introduce people to yourself a little bit, and what exactly the nature of your job is.
Yeah. So I work for a social service agency, a big nonprofit, and we do everything from working with people experiencing homelessness to veterans, to refugees and immigrants, whether they are being resettled initially or they've been here, for decades. We get to work with them, or people, looking to go through the citizenship process or any other immigration needs, as well as just your basic, social services, everything from case management, financial assistance, as well as long-term case management. And so that's where my job kind of gets to focus. Is I work on our research and innovation team. So a big focus of my job is to come up with new solutions that can help end poverty for people, and then also policy and advocacy. So I get to, design or kind of tinker with social service programs, whether that's, a national program, a local program, or something we've created, and then also get to see how does that impact people at a local level, a state level, nationally. How can we change the narrative around poverty in general? Poverty looks different for everybody, and it's something that specifically as Christians we're called to address and not ignore. So that's kind of what I get to do every day, day in and day out.
That's so cool. That I'm sure that has some very fulfilling parts of it and some very challenging and stressful parts of it, would be my guess.
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So when politicians change any policy or things like that, you're probably one of the first people who are kind of aware of like the ins and outs of the details of different legislation, because you're actually trying to innovate how to react to that. Would that be a good way of understanding how
absolutely.
Organizations react to some of the changing opportunities that exist out there for people that are at need? Okay.
Yeah. So whenever something,
go ahead.
Yeah. So if it's, it could be state, it could be local, it could be national. And so since we focus on such a broad, kind of topic of poverty, again, it could look like digging into SNAP, or what was formerly called food stamps,
Yeah.
It could be welfare reform, but it could also be something like foster care reform. How is this one new piece of legislation going to impact foster care families, kids all across, and what does that mean for people that we're serving or working with? But it could also be, workforce development. What is going on and what changes, again, legislatively, or what do we see on the ground that if something changed in legislation, it would benefit people? So it's kind of the top down and bottom up.
Very cool. Very cool. That that brings me to your post, I guess. One of the things I've been reflecting on a lot lately is kind of our refugee crisis worldwide, but then also our own realities that exist at our southern border as a country. And even yesterday, today we're recording this on a Monday, by the way, the Monday after the Super Bowl. And yesterday we've been in this series at the Belong Collective called Advent Aftermath, and we're just kind of following the stories that happen after the Advent, after Jesus is born and the time leading up to Jesus being born. And so all these stories of Jesus's youth that we typically kind of gloss over, or we don't really go into the nitty gritty of the details. And one of the things we covered yesterday was that Jesus was a refugee, like had to flee into Egypt. And we talked about that story at depth yesterday, and just the call that we have to, first of all, it seems pretty thorough throughout the Bible, our call to care for the foreigner, for the refugee, and ultimately for the least of these, in every sense of the least of these. But certainly God's heart seems to be with the person who's been displaced from their particular homeland, or, just their home, and potentially even displaced in a hurry and have nothing maybe even but what they have brought with them. And so when I saw your post, I was actually in the framework of somewhat that, sermon coming up and in mind when I reached out to you, and I was like, this will be an interesting conversation. So you said in the post, and I'll just read part of it, the past 16 weeks have been exhausting. They've been chaotic and nonstop. On September 26th, President Trump issued Executive Order 13888, requiring states and localities to provide written consent for refugee resettlement. I will save you the agonizing details, but it's been one of the toughest battles I've experienced in my 5 years doing this work. So can you explain really quick what Executive Order 13888 was addressing? Like, what were the problems it might be addressing? What exactly is the legislation for those people who just are completely unaware of this executive order? Obviously, most people are going on about their lives. They have no clue, and a lot of times what is, I guess, in these, executive orders or in legislation that's passed and such, whether that is locally or nationally. But obviously this particular executive order has made your job a little harder. So curious to know what exactly is in it and what it's reacting to.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of to start, I guess, back in the beginning, early on in our country, we decided that we would welcome refugees, we would resettle refugees, and that it was an act of legislation passed by Congress to say that, this is something that we as America are agreeing to and believe, in our core that this country was built by refugees, it was built by immigrants, and let's continue to welcome people in, in that mindset. And so the Refugee Relief Act of 1953 kind of started that, where it gave Congress the ability to, allow refugee resettlement, but then also gave, Congress and the president the ability to set a limit or a cap for how many refugees should be admitted to. So with that in mind, that's the legal obligation and the legislative kind of authority that gives our country the right and the ability to resettle refugees. And so when that first happened, that became a trend of this nation. We welcomed people. There's a process in place. We partnered with foreign countries. And so something that kind of gets into the Executive Order 13888 is that a lot of people don't necessarily know the process of how refugees get admitted, as well as that there's a difference between a refugee, an asylee, an immigrant, as well as a few different populations within that. And so refugees, they are a different group of people. They are not specifically the people that, the news talks about crossing the border or anything like that. it is a separate group of people that have been, they've been verified, they've been classified as a refugee overseas as well as by our own Department of State. And so when somebody's declared a refugee, they are fleeing persecution. It could be based on race, political, religion, something that they are no longer able to stay in their home country or their home place because of this persecution, this fear. It is an imminent threat. They have to leave. And again, that could be, war, or somebody has taken over their own country. That's something we see a lot of that I think people kind of forget. We are in 2020, and yet there are still places where people who have lived for centuries cannot call home, even though it is their own land. And that's something, again, that they are being forced to flee. We see people that live in refugee camps, so that's a lot of what's going on in Syria. But then you also have people who flee, from the Asian minor countries and go to a different place like Singapore or Thailand, and they're living in an urban city. And so they are still on the run or still don't have a place, but they're forced to kind of live in this urban environment as well. Again, they have to seek and apply for status. There is a 15-step process for a refugee to even get into a country. Specifically here in the United States, it's a 15-step process, and refugees don't get to pick where they go. Which is kind of the other thing that over the past, probably about 5 years now, we really started hearing more and more of this rhetoric that, refugees are going to have ISIS members sneaking in through the refugee process, so we have to shut the borders. Again, that was about 2015, 2016, right after the Paris attack, and where we saw, refugees going into other countries. And again, they weren't technically refugees, they were asylees. So there's just a lot of rhetoric around this group of people, and that we should be afraid. We need to pause this program. This is a similar argument that came out during 2001 with after 9/11. And again, we paused the program then. We evaluated it. We vetted it as a country, and the president and Congress said it's okay, we can continue, and so we did. However, after this time in 2015, 2016 is when we started seeing that rhetoric kind of building more and more. And, there's a lot of other language and rhetoric in our country, just kind of fear-based. And that turned into some states and some governors saying, I want to close down our borders. I don't think we should allow refugees to enter. Unfortunately, states don't have the rights to close their own borders. It's a, United States of America. And so when people come into the United States, that's kind of where we get to state rights with that. So with who can come and go into their own individual state. And so refugees, they are vetted again. They don't get to pick which country they're going to. And so if they happen to come to America, that's usually determined because they already have family here. That family is usually already established in a community. Again, these are people who have gone through some of the most horrific trauma that we just can't even fathom here. And that's not to, say that Americans or anybody living here have not experienced traumatic things, and that, we don't have, poverty or devastation here, but the type of things that we hear people coming over here experiencing, it is emptiness and it is darkness, and it is just a whole new level of devastation. Kids watching their families getting slaughtered in front of them, and just forced to run. And that's something that, it just weighs a lot. And so when people get here, when they go through the refugee process and they get placed here, and say they get placed with an agency, like the one that I work for, which is a designated refugee resettlement agency, they get here and they are assisted, they are connected to resources, they're connected to their community if it already exists here. And refugees are one of the most self-sufficient groups. Within about 6 months, we see people, employed. They are making their own money. They are established. They are not using government assistance. They are integrated. They have, businesses and homes, and it's just incredible to imagine, fleeing your home, everything you've known, learning a new language, giving up everything, and then being successful. It's incredible.
Yeah, wow, that's crazy.
Yeah. So, anyway, so they get here, so that's kind of the process of it. But this executive order came into place because President Trump felt that local cities and states didn't have the ability to really consult or, work with the refugee resettlement agencies. And so Executive Order 13888 was supposed to be giving states and localities the right to say, yes, we do welcome refugees into our area. Politically
So
speaking,
it
that
would
gets
also
into a
give
little
them
bit.
the inverse to say, no, we are not
Yeah,
welcoming. Correct?
exactly.
Is that what you're also saying? Yeah.
Yes. So it's specified in the executive order that the state governor or the local CEO of the local designation, and this vague language kind of gives into the stress of it all, have the right to say yes or to no, and that is it for that fiscal year then. That state is then allowed to resettle refugees or not. And so that started kind of this whole thing of, okay, we have to get a governor who is already outspoken against refugees, who has already said they do not want them here because of previous things that they have done. We have to now get them to sign a letter saying, yes, they are welcome. And then along with that, the locality. And so in the beginning, it was being interpreted, it must be a mayor of a city. And so people, all across the nation and every single state, people were, working together, and they were working with their mayors and they were working with their governors to get these letters signed. And then all of a sudden, after weeks of that, it came out that that interpretation was incorrect, and it's actually going to be county officials. And so it's just this constant thing of, you're trying to navigate, you're trying to do what the government has told you to do, and then all of a sudden it changes. And so with that, it just, the added stress of what that caused for not only the people on the ground doing the work, but people that were continually serving refugees at the time. You never knew kind of we don't always know what the actions of our government or the media mean to our clients too. Because they're hearing that narrative and that rhetoric too. And a lot of times, we, in our own privilege, can look at that and say, wow, that really sucks. Or, gosh, that's so incorrect, or that's wrong. But for somebody to hear that, that's talking about themselves. That's, a country and a state and a city saying, no, you're not welcome here as a person. And again, these aren't people who, just decided one day to pack up their lives and come here. They had to go through years and years of vetting, of security backgrounds. And again, if you don't pass one of the security measures, then you have to start all over again. It's not an easy thing. And so if you time out or it took too long to vet you, you have to start all over again. And so it can be a lot. And so that's a big concern too, is just kind of the stress and the weight of carrying that of, I want to believe and I want to say that this person, is acting on the better half of their people, the people that they represent. But then you hear some conversations and you're like, but you're not even basing this decision on facts. That's just an assumption that you have that's incorrect. And so there's a balance too of how do I educate this person without insulting them. So that's kind of a big piece of what that is and what it was doing. So
is every state currently kind of trying to figure out where their governor stands on this, I would assume, or at least like agencies within each state, I'm sure, are trying to determine exactly where their governor stands on this, because this went into effect back in September, right?
So it was issued back in September that we had 90 days to kind of get it done. And so that meant, ironically, the day that it was given the 90 days meant that the deadline would fall on Christmas. And so,
perfect.
When you're in a religious organization, you're kind of looking at that and you're like, you really want to shut the door on refugees? Like, you're doing it on the ultimate day.
On Christmas.
Christ, who was a refugee on his birthday, or what we celebrate as birthday. And so halfway through that, we started working towards that date. And then again, something would change and it's, actually now you have till January. And so it was kind of working. And again, things would change. And now we have a deadline of January 21st. And so that kind of gave us a little bit more room. And then in the middle of all of that chaos, a lawsuit was filed saying that, this is not the legal right. The executive office can't actually, kind of overstep Congress's ability within this, and due process comes into play of, can a president give states the authority to make this decision? And so it got all tied up in the courts. And so the day before, or about, let's see, I think it was January 17th, the court ruled that this was unconstitutional, and that this actually, we aren't sure that this is in the president's right and executive's ability. And so that paused everything. And so at that time, there were about 41 governors who had signed on and said, yes, we will welcome refugees. We will, let them come in. But then when the court issued its standing, it kind of held the executive order. And so for the time being, we can continue acting as normal. We can continue resettling as normal for the rest of this fiscal year, and kind of continue moving until
that
the court
goes
either rules on it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
so it'll have to go to either the appeals court or something like that. But, you're doing all of this, and then it's also an election year coming up. And so what does that mean? And how do people really do this? And again, regardless of the intent, I can't obviously know President Trump's intention when he made this, but regardless of whatever the intention was or wasn't, 41 governors stood up and said, we will welcome refugees. And that's obviously was not all one side or the other.
Yeah.
It was bipartisan, and that just goes to show that people do understand, it is our call and it is our duty, as well as some states, you forget about, again, as the United States of America, you are not your own independent country. You don't get to close your borders to other people. And so if, you're in North Carolina and the governor says yes, and then South Carolina says no, you can't stop people from moving across that border once they, enter into the country. And so that was another component of this, so if, a state says no and its bordering states all say yes, and a refugee is resettled in, a bordering state that says yes, nothing is going to be able to stop that person or that family from joining their family in the state that said no. And so now you've dismantled that state that has said no. You've dismantled the refugee resettlement programs within there. So now that refugee family is without resources. They are going to still come because their family is there and they want to be unified. They want to enter into the community. They want to be established. They want that. They desire that support system too. And so then we have this secondary migration issue of, well, if one state says no and others say yes and people are still coming, how do we serve them? Now is when we start talking about, well, that's, taxpayer dollars are going to be going into that. We're going to have to be using public benefits to support refugees because the state decided to, remove its support. So that's a whole other kind of interesting layer to it. But again, at the end of the day, it comes down to, this is something that not only, United States Congress has said that we have the ability to do and should be able to do, but then also from a faith perspective, like you were saying, like we are called to welcome the stranger. Matthew 25 clearly states that. And again, throughout the Bible, people were welcomed in, and they were taking care of each other. They were supporting one another. And that's just at the most basic level of what we as Christians should be doing. But then also, ironically, we always would go back to, for years and years, think about all the times, whether it was in our youth group, when we'd go to Nicaragua or, other places, where it's like we spent so much time praying for these countries across the world, for them to come to know Jesus, for these people to come to know Jesus. And we would send people out, and God answered that by bringing people to us. And we want to say no, like that just blows my mind, where it's like, we prayed for decades as a church, as an international church, as a Christian church here, for people to know Jesus. And then when God's like, okay, I'm not going to save you guys, so you don't have to get on a plane and fly away. I'm going to bring them to your home. And we were like, oh no, that's not what we wanted. We wanted to go there so that we didn't have to discomfort ourselves. Yeah. So it's always interesting to see that from the Christian side.
Did we go to Nicaragua together? I thought we did, right? You were on the Nicaragua trip?
I think.
Yeah.
Once or twice, so.
Yeah, I think I don't know if I went twice with you or just once. Like, I can't remember. I know Hillary was on one of those trips, and I want to say you were on
I
that
think
same
Hillary
trip.
and I went on the first one.
Yeah.
The first time we went was with you, and then we kept going. We went a few more times. But.
Yeah, very cool, very cool. Awesome. Yeah, I mean, you said so much there and so much good stuff in the sense of connecting it to our faith. Someone who, just to be real, for some people, life is going so fast, and they have so much that they're
Yeah.
focused on, that like they turn on the news and there's already so much drama in their life, or so
Mhm.
much stuff requiring their attention, that ultimately it's like, I don't have time for an impeachment trial, for a presidential debate, for what this politician tweeted and what this politician tweeted in response, and let alone do I have time for like how refugees are resettled. It's like I'd like to care about that, but it's just so hard to have the energy. And look, I actually really sympathize with those people. I've got 3 kids. I mean,
Oh,
it's
absolutely.
like life is going, and it can be hard to stay connected to what matters most. But obviously, in this particular conversation, you're like intimately connected to it, even more
Mhm.
so than very, very much more so than most people. How One of the things that's really affected me in this particular conversation about refugee and immigrant, I want to be clear, because I do think they are different statuses. Like,
Yeah.
like you clearly, meant to separate the different things, because I do think refugee resettlement, there's been, like you said, so much vetting in that process, and
Mhm.
as you said, I think asylum seeker is a different status, and
Yep.
someone just desiring to immigrate to the United States for a
Yep.
job or for a better life or whatever. These are all, and I'm sure there's multiple other buckets that and criteria that people fall into. But ultimately, one of the things that's been really disheartening for me, and this is even someone who's not super connected to this in the way you are, but someone who's grew up in church, has a faith, is just how apathetic the church has been, and if not
Mhm.
apathetic, almost completely on the other side of like allowing fear to be the narrative that they buy into. Like, can you speak about how that, and I'm obviously talking about the broader church. There's some churches that are doing great work
Yeah.
on this. I don't want to, um, you know, uh, say every church out there doesn't care about this, or every Christian out there. So that's not what I'm trying to say. But I'm saying it seems like when you look at polling numbers at large, the church is like apathetic, or even like responding in fear when it comes to
Mhm.
these conversations about refugee, asylum seeker, and immigrant resettlement. And so, can you share how that makes you feel as someone who loves Jesus and who's also intimately connected to these people's lives and this work?
Yeah. So I have some family members who definitely fall into that other camp of, they love Jesus, and yeah, you're sitting there and you're like, how do you not get this? Like, I don't understand that this is a Christian's calling to welcome and to love and to take care of, and a lot of it is just this fear based of, well, what does it mean for me? What am I going to lose out on? Or again, it is that fear of, but I've seen, reports of terrorism. I've seen these things, and it's like, how do we put aside the fear that we have of this world and focus instead of, what God has called us to do? Um, I think that's it's such a hard thing, and it comes down to, our own comfort and our own, a lot of times privilege, that we don't have to think about it, that we can turn things off and not worry about it. And again, that is not to say that everybody should be full-time, 100% diving into this and following every single tweet and article and thing that comes out. Because again, we have to protect our own hearts too. I think Proverbs talks about that in a way that we don't think about, that protect your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. And that, goes from everything to relationships and, how you interact with people, but also, what are you consuming, and is that good for you? And news right now is not probably protecting your heart for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so I think, there's a few different aspects of that. Of one thing, God tells us not to fear the world. Like, the only thing we should be fearing is Him, and it is not out of a, an angry or shameful or disappointed place, but of, God, you are so mighty. I am, in awe of you type of fear. And when we turn that into, I'm afraid of this person instead, that's where I think that just boils up, and the enemy just gets to sneak in there and continue festering that.
Yeah.
I turn it also for something for a lot of Christians, and shockingly, most people that are anti-immigrant or refugee are most likely pro-life, and I have never been able to understand that. I do not know how you can rationalize being pro-life and, wanting dignity and respect for every life, but you would not be, praying those prayers if you were standing in Syria right now. And how do you determine that? How do you determine which life is worthy of protecting or defending? Because if you were out there marching on Capitol Hill saying, I believe that, birth should happen, then that means you should be standing there saying, the child who's watched their family get slaughtered in front of them has been, vetted even to be determined that they are allowed to come into this country, and yet we say no. And so how do you justify that? How do you say that it's okay for one but not the other? And I think a lot of times people kind of shun from that because, things like racism get brought up then, or, fear of Islamophobia or different things where it's like, no, you're still talking about a person at the end of the day. And if you truly mean you are pro-life, that is not a pro-life if they are this type of way, if they look like this, if they, are guaranteed to be this person when they grow up. It's, no, you believe that Jesus said every life is valuable, so we live by that.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big part of it too. And, even as a church, again, going back to the irony of missionary work, where we'll say we'll go across and, go spend 2 weeks, loving and playing and praying and helping establish communities and churches, and that is great, and there's a place for that. But then if we don't come back and continue that by saying, like, yes, I will welcome and maybe be comforted about something because these people could come here too. I think that's another aspect of the church to consider as well. I think tangibly what that actually looks like, again, is just like praying through that, asking God and being willing to say, I think I might be biased, or I might have a prejudice against this, or why do I question, refugee admissions? Why am I scared of that? And, to come down to race, again, racism, some type of prejudice, but it could also be worshiping of security. God did not call us to live a safe and comfortable life. And so sometimes when we are concerned about things, there's definitely a reason for that. God also called us to protect one another, to live in harmony, to, not just be dormant. He, said it was okay to have war in certain instances and to fight in certain times. And Jesus got angry, but it's also not our place to go against the other side of that, of when he has provided a way for this person, who are we to go against, what he has ordained in that matter too. Yeah. So that I think is a big part of it, is just also being willing as a church to say, like, what could we be doing? It doesn't mean that you have to go out and volunteer with your local refugee resettlement agency, but it could just mean we're going to dedicate to pray for, a lot of times refugees are, again, they could be fleeing from religious persecution. And when we talked with our governor and stuff, there's a big fear, again, of a certain population that has been described as the refugee in the media. And, when you actually look at the data, the majority of refugees coming that we've resettled or worked with are Christians from the Congo. And it's like, you want to say that we're a Christian nation, but you can't even accept your brothers and sisters just because they come from a different place. Wow. So that's a lot of rambling, I know.
No, it's so good. It's like I don't even want to interrupt with the questions that I have as you're going. Like I think what you really are arguing for is, and something I say all the time, is all humanity, every single person is an image bearer of God, no matter what they've done, no matter what they're going to do, no matter their background or not. And I can't understand why the church can't be the place that argues for the compassionate ethic when it comes to image bearers. And not that doesn't mean there may not be a reason for security that the government has to argue for. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
But I don't think the church should be arguing that. And some people will call me naive for that, and that's fine. But I guess I just come down to, I don't ever see Jesus saying, let's be safe here. Like, it seems like Jesus is always rolling the dice for compassion, and ultimately I think his followers are doing the same. And And that just, it would just be very hard for me to, like you referenced the sheep and the goats. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
that's a scary teaching. And, we always
Yeah.
throw that into the parable camp, because if it's a parable, we can just kind of look the other way and say, well, we're just not interpreting it right. But like, if you read that in context with all the other parables in the scriptures, it does not start out like a parable, and it almost doesn't even seem like it is a parable. It seems like Jesus is teaching
Mm-hmm.
point blank that message, that this isn't to be like deciphered like some other parables are to be deciphered. Jesus is clearly saying, like, when you see people who are in need, you see me. And if you can't
Mm-hmm.
see me, then there's something wrong with you. Like
Yeah.
you need to be. And then like we have other passages that it's like, if you have the means to meet someone else's need and you don't meet it, how can the love of God be in you? That's a legit question in our
Mm-hmm.
scripture. And it's like, it's a question that should cause all of us, even those of us who feel like we do have a compassion ethic, to say, God, wow, okay, how can I expand my compassionate ethic? Because there's certainly people I
Mm-hmm.
come in contact with that I have the ability to help meet their need, and maybe I look the other way, or I just convince myself I'm doing enough. And so like, I think that there's not a finish line there. The goal is that we would be continually
Yeah.
expanding in our generosity and in our ability to see others and give others the attention we would give if Jesus was right in our midst. And
Oh,
I
yeah.
just feel like right now, like we are, it seems to me like the church I grew up in, and I don't know if you resonate with this as much. I know you're from a different generation growing up in church. And I know in our youth group, we talked a lot about justice issues, because that
Mm-hmm.
was on my heart. And so that was something we talked about a lot. But like, I don't remember the church talking a lot about justice issues necessarily, but I do always remember the church talking about values and compassion and caring for
Mm-hmm.
others, and loving even dangerously, like, and not necessarily like from a justice perspective necessarily, but more just like, this is what Jesus would have us do. And I almost feel like we're just kind of excusing that away these days. Like, well, that doesn't
Oh,
fit with
yeah.
what we need right now. And it's like, no, that is what we need. Like, that's exactly what we need
Mm-hmm.
right now. I don't know. It's disheartening for me, and I'm confident for you, being as deeply connected as you are. It's even more difficult. Has that challenged your relationship to the church over the last 5 years? I'm just curious from a personal
Oh,
standpoint.
yeah.
Yeah. Can you
Yeah.
go
So
into
I
that a
think,
little bit? Because I think there's some people listening who
yeah.
probably have had their connection to the church. And I mean, a lot of people will use the label like the evangelical church, but I guess just church in general,
Mm-hmm.
like, how has that challenged that? How are you navigating that?
Yeah. So, starting back, I think what you were saying of, our youth group was definitely, I mean, we were reading Sean, was it
Shane
Sean
Claiborne.
King's, Shane Claiborne,
Yeah,
there you go,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
in our book club and stuff. And again, we were, let's go out, let's do this, like, let's serve, and let's be, the hands and feet. And I think for me, even within that time, because I worshiped so much of that, I didn't really see or connect the God part to it. And I missed so much of grace and where we are. And not, that was from ninth grade to probably my senior year of college, of just believing this idea that, social justice wasn't something that I needed to focus on in America. It was overseas. It was people needed me. I needed to be the hands and feet, in a third world country. That was where God, that's where he would show up and what he would do and where he would fix. And it was just this blind side of like, no, this country is broken and there are so many things that we have to fix here. And not fix necessarily, but just minister to and preach and love and,
Yeah.
Be the hands and feet here in our own neighborhood. And what does that look like? And I think, that's part of it is, as a church, we are called to be, focused on social justice and all of these issues. And I think a lot of time, especially in this American church, it can either go one way where that's all we focus on, and the other side of, there are just so many things. What do I do and how do I pick? And, I think tying even back to something you said before, how do you determine where your attention goes? And, not everybody needs to be going out on mission trips and stuff, and not everybody needs to be focused on, feeding the hungry and loving the widow and visiting the, those in prison. But we should all be trying at least one of those. And it doesn't mean then that the other person doing the other thing is now wrong.
Yeah.
And I think when you throw politics in there, that's where we get this kind of warped thing of, well, no, I want to serve the homeless here. How can you be saying let's bring people into this country instead and focus on them? And it's like, that's the infinite amount of love of Jesus. Like, we might not be able to understand that, but that's God in action, is that he did not say, I can only focus on one group of people. He equipped hundreds and thousands and millions of us to love so many ways and so many different, missions and groups of people. And that's why we can do things. And, again, I have people that say, well, you clearly don't care about, the veterans then, because you want to use our money to, serve refugees or to welcome the immigrants, or, what about the orphans here, that, those in foster care. And it's like, back to the Facebook post, like, I get to work on all of those issues, and I see every single way that we are helping in a country, to serve all of those populations. And I can tell you there are resources available for all of them, and every group, needs your support and needs your compassion and needs, to be fighting alongside them for the social justice issue. But it doesn't mean that you have to negate the other group that's doing something good too, because that's just what God has placed on their heart or called them to do.
I found that.
Just imagine if the disciples argued over that,
Yeah.
like what country they should go to. They split up, and that's okay. We can too.
Yeah. I found that most people arguing whataboutism, like, just like, and I hate to say it this way, but there's some prejudice in their mind, whether that is prejudice for this group that is so heavy because they're deeply connected to it, that they just don't want to see any resources flow elsewhere, but they haven't connected the consequences of that reality for those other individuals, or a prejudice that simply is they don't understand these other people. Maybe they're not connected to those stories, or maybe the stories they have heard are just overtly negative, and they don't understand that there are real needs that exist in that particular community. I've received, even before with, posts I've made about immigration. Well, what about the homeless, here we got to take care of? And it's like, both. And like, why can't we do both?
Yeah.
Like I don't think there should be a limit to, our generosity, in this reality of people who are at the margins, especially those, who are coming from war-torn countries seeking refugee resettlement, who have been vetted, like you said, like all these check boxes. And I think a lot of people just buy into the notion that, well, that's not working. Those people haven't been vetted well, or like if you had to say, here's 3 myths that people believe about refugees or immigrants or asylum seekers, whatever whichever kind of subcategory you want to go into, what would those like top 3 myths that you hear and it kind of drives you crazy because you're like, oh, that's so not how it works, or that's so not true, or like, I mean, because we have a lot of, misinformation out there around all kinds of political realities, but I'm just curious on this one, which ones with your expertise, you're like, I hear that so much and it's so wrong. And it doesn't have to be a top 3. It could be a few, whatever you maybe pops in your head when I ask that question.
So I think just sticking on the refugee issue, to not confuse again all the different populations that fall under immigrants or asylees, but specifically with the refugee issue of, number one is the safety concern or security issue, where again, it used to be, before President Trump was elected, it used to be a 13-step process. And so he's even increased the level of security. And so people, saying, well, it's still not safe, it's like, well, you're going against your own president then, who stopped the entire refugee process for 120 days, found it to be okay, and still increased security measures. Like, there are no, loopholes in place. Well, I shouldn't say no loopholes. I'm sure somebody could find one. But the reality of it, I mean, the security that people have to go through to be vetted and to possibly get, luckily drawn to come here is not a strategic measure. Like, again, you don't get to pick which country you're being resettled in. And so if you're home, chances that people are going to come here and create terrorism, or this is their one way to get in. It's like, absolutely not. Like, it's a luck of a draw that you get placed in the States, and after you've gone through the security process. And part of that 15-step process that existed before President Trump and still exists today is that you have to be screened, and the security step doesn't end once you get on that plane. Like, it continues once you're in this country. As well as, the type of people that are coming here of, they're just coming here because that's the easiest way to do it. The immigration process takes too long. And it's like, these people have been waiting, again, starving. They have been living in camps. We have clients that come here who share about how, they had one bowl of rice for a week to survive on. And getting to come here is just like this amazement thing that I cannot even, explain the amount and abundance here. So I think that's one part, is just the security aspect of it. And, people are coming here for, what's the word, malicious intent, or, some reason like that. And
yeah, now real quick, before you go on to the next one, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to ask a follow-up on that, because you made it clear that people don't get to choose America. I know for a while, and I don't know if this is still the case, there was a banned list of people that we were not accepting. Was that refugee, immigrant, asylum seeker, all of the above? I know there were a variety of countries on that list. Some were, I believe, South American countries, but some were Middle Eastern countries. Do you know what I'm referencing? I think it was 7 countries, if I remember correctly. Is that still the case? Yeah,
there was a Muslim ban. It was dubbed the Muslim ban because a lot of the countries happened to be where they were a primary, Muslim majority. And so that happened in 2016, I believe, 2017, when we stopped halted the refugee program. And so at the time it was refugees and immigrants. Now it is just primarily immigrants. And President Trump just updated it, adding in an expansion of it for immigrant visas. And so now it includes Eritrea, Kyrgyzstan, Burma, Nigeria, Sudan, and Tanzania.
And what were the countries? What were the initial countries? Do you know offhand? Because I know there was one Latin American country, I want to say.
Venezuela was on there.
Okay.
Let me.
It's okay if you don't know offhand. I mean, people can Google it. I'm more.
You wanted to know. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm more just interested in whether or not, I think sometimes like these things hit in waves and waves and waves, and you're just kind of like, that's not happening anymore. But then it's like, no, that's still there. That's still a reality that we have to deal with. Is that still a reality?
Yeah. And so the other ones were, the original kind of 7 of them were around Iran, Libya, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, and then along with Venezuela and North Korea. Okay. So some of them were taken off, and again, it was challenged in courts. But yeah, it's still a real thing. And again, you have people that have waited so many years to come and join their families, and it's devastating for some to just be so close and get that door shut on them. Again, people, on the refugee side, where we had, people wanting to reunify with their families, with their kids, with their parents. And, again, they've been vetted, they've been securely processed, and then something like that happens and you're just left waiting.
So if I'm a refugee from Yemen, and I, find, I guess, myself in a refugee camp, but my country of origin is Yemen, I would have a difficult time finding refugee resettlement in the United States, or it would be absolutely impossible under the current
not under, I don't think so, because it was immigration visas, and so not necessarily refugees.
So not refugee status necessarily, so. but any immigration. So let's say some of my family had got here under refugee status, and I wanted to join them as an immigrant, I would probably likely not be able to do that, or that would be a difficult reality. Okay.
if you were not coming as a refugee. So
If
there's
yeah.
different paths of it within the refugee. If, say Brittany and the kids were here and they came across as refugees, you might have all applied at the same time, but you might have been separated from them in that process. And so it could take a while, or, it could have to restart. But it's most likely if your family applied as a refugee, you applied with them as a refugee too.
Sure. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, but we see that, often too, and that's, I think, kind of going on to this other myth of a lot of times, especially in, 2015 to probably even now, we hear this idea that the average refugee is this Middle Eastern male coming over. And then that is, we see kids coming over here that, again, they applied with their family and they got through, and their parents or one of their parents is still back in a camp or still separated from them. And so you have kids coming over here, by themselves. And what do you do with a, 10-year-old who is now in the country by themselves and has no other choice? They can't go back to the refugee camp. They can't go back to their home country, but now they're here. And so there's a refugee program through the State Department too that works specifically for refugee foster care kids.
Wow.
And so, that's the other side of this, is that, people talk about, international adoptions or caring for the youth and the child and the orphan. And it's like, we have kids here that are just as affected by these refugee, programmatic decisions. Thankfully for this past one, it did not affect the kids coming over. And so that was a big blessing that kids were considered a special population, and so they would have been able to continue. But when we shut the refugee program down in 2017 to vet it, that was the whole thing of, these kids are literally waiting to board a plane, or they're already here, and what happens then? They've been split up from their siblings. That's trauma all over again.
Yeah.
So,
wow.
That's definitely a component. And a reality for so many kids.
So a 10-year-old comes over here, I'm assuming they've either been separated from their parents in the midst of conflict, probably war or whatever conflict they've experienced, violence they've experienced, or they've very likely lost their parents to violence and maybe even are aware of that.
Yep.
And they find themselves probably in a refugee camp applying for refugee status. And as a 10-year-old, I mean, who can really grasp the concept of what that is? And then they find themselves in a whole new country, and and then they're put into a foster care system. Trying to place them in homes would be my guess. Like, the goal is to get them into
so there's specifically
adoption.
foster care.
Okay.
Kind of. So the tricky side with that is that a lot of times they can't be placed into adoption. But it's a specific program for refugee foster care kids.
I understand.
So it's separate than the national system or a state-based system. But a lot of the kids, you can't technically put them up for adoption or, facilitate adoptions because they might have a parent. And so they haven't given up custody of that child. And so that's this thing, too, of, you have a 10-year-old coming over here, and who knows if they have a parent. They might. But that kid has to, balance that too. And it's just, it's incredible seeing the resiliency of these kids that come over here, but also, again, the families in general. But we have kids that, they come through and they're placed in a refugee foster care family. And, they are graduating high school in, 3 years and going on to college. It blows my mind. That's how incredibly just resilient these kids are. And you have families
trauma,
too. And
so much trauma in their
background,
and then they're just able to overcome that. Like, wow.
Yeah. And this kind of goes into the third thing again. And a lot of times after I've kind of gone through all the points I have with people of, well, what about this? And here's this truth, and here's this thing. At the end of the day, a lot of times I just say, like, have you ever met a refugee? Have you ever sat down and had coffee with one? Have you ever just, befriended someone that's different from you, or their experience, and heard what it was like, what they had to go through? Not only the emotional and traumatic side, but just the process. Because so many people, especially here in this country, make, decisions or stances, and they've never heard or experienced the other side. And that is such a big thing, to actually put a face and a story and person to what you are supporting or not supporting. again, and this is something that, and I'll say it on here too, because I've said it to him multiple times, my dad, we'll go back and forth on this stuff. And, I just remember the day I asked him, like, so are you telling me that if for some reason America was, completely taken over and we were forced to run and flee, are you telling me you wouldn't try every single thing to get us out of this country? Like, I don't believe that. I know your love for me. I know your love for us as a family and for how much you have worked hard. And I just do not believe that at the end of the day, you would not try everything to protect us and to make sure we had a prosperous life. And that is what these parents go through.
Yeah.
If it is a parent with them, they have to make the decision to flee, to run, to leave every single thing behind and hope that they get picked. Because, again, it's not every single person that goes to a refugee camp gets it. It's a small population that even get put into the refugee resettlement programs, let alone those that even get to America. And that's where, you're questioning another parent's decisions for, protecting their children. And I believe if my dad, if we, were born in Iran or in Syria and we were being prosecuted, I think he would try every single thing to help us. And that might look like becoming a refugee. And what would you do if that was split, And again, you talk about the resiliency. We have people that were, surgeons in their home country to come here and not just one have to make that tough decision, but then they get here and the humility they have to walk in of knowing that they were, a prestigious person with lots of respect and probably well established to now, the best we can offer for a job is working in a chicken factory, for a meat processing plant. And like just the humility that takes to serve your family and to love your kids, like that is the sacrifice of I care and love so deeply of like that's biblical love right there, that you are willing to put aside yourself to take care of your family. And I mean, it amazes me every time.
Wow.
Yeah, just
that was
to
a
know
great
that
answer.
somebody has made that sacrifice.
That was a great answer to that question. I like that. One of the things I always tell people when it comes to issues of, social justice especially is I don't think we change our mind because we get the right data in front of our eyes. I think we change our mind when we are in relationship with people, when we hear their stories. And that's part of one of the goals of this podcast is just kind of to humanize these conversations a little bit, definitely to talk to people who are in different places, doing different things, pushing the boundaries a little bit for the sake of love and belonging. But also to kind of just say, like, we need to hear stories. And then hopefully from those stories, it opens our heart up to maybe reconsidering the data that we've been handed or the way we've been handed to see the world. And I think so often in my story, it's been when I've got to know somebody, and they've broken down some of what I've been handed on how to see them or how to see the world, that in those moments is when I often, I guess, am coming back to, I wonder if I need to reconsider where I stand on this, subject matter or whatever. I mean, that's so important. Is there a moment that connected you to this work? Or, I mean, this is kind of the type of work that, in my opinion, requires a little bit of a calling. Like it's not easy work. I'm sure there's times where you're pretty depressed, and while you do have those days where it's like, I guess I would say, like, it seems to me like this work would be high highs and low lows. Like, I'm sure there's like really high moments where a family gets placed or a child gets placed and you're just feeling really great about, what your work has accomplished. And then there's probably other times where you're pulling your hair out and depressed because some person in a suit signed a piece of paper that ultimately affects so many people's lives. And you got to be the one to let them know that, or the one that, ultimately tells them no, or tells them that this isn't possible. That's a heavy burden. And I find that, like, in those kind of work environments where it's heavy, high highs and low lows, usually those people need to be called to it, or they can't stick in it very long. Do you have a moment of calling you felt like into this particular work, or was there a catalyst for that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think one, and this will kind of tie into it, just want to go back to something you were just saying of, changing people's minds and how does that, changing our values and stuff, and just tying into the question you just asked of, like, that's, I think, just where grace comes into it again of, like, well, wait, like, maybe I've got this wrong. Maybe, let me have grace for not only this person and their, perspective, but, like, I hope they have grace for me too, that, like, I might be ignorant on something, or I might be incorrect. And I think that just, that ties into a lot of kind of where I've come from and where I stand on things with, it has to be by grace and grace alone and through Jesus. And that, when I left good old Ashburn, I went to college, I started studying social work and thought, I'm going to be a therapist, or I'm going to help people, or I'm going to be a missionary and I'm just going to go back overseas and continue to love people and work with people there, because, again, that's where I can be the hands and feet of Christ. And I had such a warped understanding of anything within that and what grace even was. And it wasn't until probably my junior year in a internship at a recovery center for specializing on domestic violence, women that were being court ordered to go through drug treatment. And I remember, working with them and just thinking, like, this is it. This is where I'm at. This is going to be great. And, when I tell my story or my testimony of coming to know Jesus, I really, I don't really consider much of that up until probably 2015 is really when my life changed and started, following God and understanding who he was and what this whole thing is. And so, being 20 years old and thinking I'm going to save these people and I'm going to, again, just this savior mentality of I can do this and I can change it. And I'd work with these women and they'd come in and we'd go through a whole plan. And on the 28th day, they would get ready to leave and the person to come pick them up would be their abuser. And I would just sit there and be like, what the hell are you doing?
Man.
What is going on? Like, what happened to all of the work we just did? What happened to everything you said? Like, what are you doing? And not understanding that there was so much more outside of that, and that I was not understanding where they were coming from. Like, I did not have that background or knowledge of the things that were happening, not only in their own lives, but their generation. What had they experienced? And what was going on in their community? And so I went back to one of my professors one day and was just like, I can't do this. Like, nobody is listening to me. I know what's best. I don't understand what's going on. I don't think I can be a therapist because I just want to tell people what to do and they don't care. Yeah. And it's just, that's very, very much my personality. Like, I just tell you what to do and I promise I have the answer. And if you just followed me, it'd be right. Again, that savior mentality.
Really quick. Do you know the Enneagram?
Yeah. I do. This is probably somewhere in my Enneagram. I do not believe in it because I'm like, this is not fair. I know that I'm not an 8. So
you're not an 8? You're not an 8?
I'm not an 8.
Okay.
No,
okay.
I know that's the only thing I know.
I was going to say, like, I wonder if Shannon's an 8. I'm an 8, so I didn't know if you were an 8.
No,
but I didn't know what you thought about the Enneagram. I was like, for 6 months long, I was like super skeptical of the Enneagram. So it's okay if you're skeptical of the Enneagram. It usually means if you're skeptical, it usually means you're an 8, though. So.
Well, that goes back into all of, like, there's so much of, like, the church even worshiping the Enneagram. And anyways, I'm speaking on a panel next week about spiritual gifts versus the Enneagram and where does God come into it.
Oh,
so
nice.
It's the whole thing. But so if anybody's in forward sexes, come on down. But anyway, so sitting there talking to my professor and I'm like, I just can't do this. And she said, have you looked into what's going on in that community? Like, look at your clients and their demographics. And I was like, okay, sure, whatever. And I saw that every single one of them came from legitimately within like a 5-mile radius of each other. And I was like, what the hell is happening in this neighborhood? And it turns out the male unemployment rate was so high in that area. And I was like, what? So what's going on? And so as you, like, dive into it and find out that the male unemployment rate is so high, and so, we can make some deductions here. Men might be turning to drugs and alcohol in order, because that's the only thing that they can do out here in rural, Virginia, where there's not a lot of opportunities. And, what does transportation mean? They are stuck in this community. Nobody can go and leave it. And so it's just this cycle of generational poverty, just continuing and continuing. And the men are teaching them, the boys, and the girls are teaching the girls, and it just continues. And so what does that look like to break that? And so that's when I started reading more into like, okay, what does a community-based social worker do? What does that look like from that approach? And all of a sudden, start diving into this policy side of it. And, what are we doing as a nation or as a city to support each other and to really love each other as, like the hands and feet of God? He cared for all of the people, not just, the Pharisees who, he had a whole mission to kind of revolutionize their world, but also like the poor or the abuser or, the offender that is being in prison. Like, what happened in their life to get them to that place? And so just starting to ask this question of, maybe I don't have all the answers because I can't see it because it's not something you can see. What if it is this generational thing or this community thing? And so that's kind of what started changing it. And then, I graduated undergrad. I went to grad school. And as I was graduating, I prayed in a very typical, again, savior mentality. God, I will be your hands and feet. Send me wherever you want. And I thought he was going to send me to where I was doing mission work on and off there at college in Uganda. And he said, in the most clearest way, you're going to Knoxville, Tennessee for grad school. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, I'm not going to like white urban, like suburbia. And he called me there, and that was just incredible to get to see, like, I was humbled a lot and walked in a lot of humility and just learned so much about who God was and what grace was, and realized, like, this just pride and arrogance of I can save someone, I can do it, of not even knowing what I was saving them from was just, like, completely knocked me out. And so after graduating, I found this organization. One of my professors had connected me here, and just some of the research I was doing in grad school connected to a lot of what they were doing, and just kind of got plugged in and got a job offer and moved right out here after graduation. I called my parents actually as I was about 2 weeks before graduation and said, I think I'm going to move to Texas for a job. And they're like, well, I thought you were moving back home or something else. And I was like, no, I'm up, on the way to the airport for an interview. And that was pretty sporadic. And basically just since then got here and just learned, like, again, the assumptions that we have of people is just not the full story. And you have to just continue asking this question of, why? Why is it like that? What happened in that person's life to make them think that or believe that? And, that ties into those highs and lows of, you see something and something so successful, whether it's around refugees or, other people in poverty, whether it's a piece of legislation that passes or we get to develop a new program and actually have, research and evidence saying these people's lives are changed. And that is incredible to just know that you got to be a piece of that story. And, God used you in this tiny, tiny way to literally bring them closer to, his purpose for them or, restore dignity or encourage their value and worth. And that is incredible. But then also those lows where you're just sitting there and questioning, like, what on earth happened? Like, what could I have done differently? Again, and that's just where this lie again is like that savior mentality of something I could have done to change it. And that is just where at the end of the day, I have to go back to God and say, like, it is your plan. Like, ultimately, like, whatever has happened, whatever has done, like, I have to trust that you are bigger than this. And a lot of times the people in this work, you get burned out so fast, especially like with the media these days and conversations. And when you work in, policy and advocacy and research, even when you go home, those conversations continue because it's the news now, or it's something that was posted or something happened, and you don't really get to turn it off. And, even going to church, people are talking about things and, messages on certain stuff. And it's just this continual consumption. At the end of the day, like, the only time you can find silence sometimes in peace is like, God, like, I know this is bigger than me and I know this is bigger than us. And like, when kingdom come, and I pray it comes quick because it's getting crazy, like, it will look like heaven on earth. And like, that is what we get to rest in, is that like the lowest lows, like the enemy's schemes, man's schemes, like, still do not out triumph God's plan and like God's goodness of what Genesis should have originally looked like, what the Garden of Eden was originally designed. And so just resting in that, right? Like, we are fighting the good fight, and like, that is what we get to end with, is that like, good and faithful servant, like, you have served me, not man, not yourself. Like, that is what we get to rest in. So
you're preaching, Shannon. Look at you.
I tell you, like, very different. The high school Shannon.
You must have had a good youth pastor back in the day,
Oh,
who
man.
imported all
No,
this. No,
I
I'm
don't know
just
how
kidding.
you
I'm
did
just
it.
kidding. I'm not taking any credit at all. No, that's awesome. That's so cool. I love how you gave such a great example for something I say all the time, which is like, where can we find the understanding with our enemy? And like, I
Yeah.
guess what I mean by that is, look, no one's going to argue for compassion for someone who's abusing their wife. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
No one. Like, that's
Yeah.
nor understanding. Does that make sense? Like,
Mm-hmm.
no one's arguing for that. But the interesting thing is, if you actually have the discipline of like trying to pause, quiet the emotions that are often anger, frustration, bitterness, maybe even revenge, and also even justice, like trying to quiet
Yeah.
even the justice part of you for a moment and say, why did this happen?
Yeah.
And then actually do the work of like trying to figure that out. You recognize, wow, there are some factors here. They're not excuses for the person's behavior. Like, they're not reasons that they're not responsible for what the choices they've made. But there are tangible things we could change that could help this not be the next person's story, or at least move the needle so that it might not be the next person's story. Because the inadequacy that a man might feel in that culture, not having a job, might lead them to alcohol and substance abuse. And then ultimately, I would assume the percentage likelihood of someone who's abusing alcohol and drugs toward being violent skyrockets at that point. You know what I mean? And so like,
oh yeah.
So you just look at all these markers and you're like, wow, okay, so we can keep treating women here. And like, yeah, that work needs to be done on the back end, but we can actually like step in over here with a compassion and understanding for what's leading people into this and say, wow, if we can transform the jobs in this culture, we could actually potentially help relieve this issue. That requires a love for even your enemy. Does that make sense? Like a compassion and an understanding, even for people that you're deeply hurt by or that you've seen the effects of their evil. You know what I mean? And I think that's such a mature faith to be able to come to that place to where you're able to do that. Because that it does take so much, I think, like pause and ability and patience to do that.
And I think that's where, so much again of, it took so long in my life of, my faith and testament, aside from work side of, personal battles and struggles and suffering, of asking God, like, where are you? Like, where are you, this justice warrior, like fighting for my, where is my wrath being delivered? And when you take that out and have to finally say, like, nothing I can do for, my personal vengeance or my personal, sense of justice is ever going to outweigh, like, the reality of God's wrath and justice. That's where you can kind of start, standing back and saying, like, okay, I am called to love and, serve and to be compassionate. But then also, that's where, like, God did create the government. He did put things in, in structure and ordained those things. And that's where, I'm called to love and support and have compassion for, people who are doing wrong, but also get to trust in them. Like, God has set up a justice, his own justice system, but also, like, that is why we do need legislation and policies in place. And, Stephen, my brother, and I will go back and forth on this. And at a lot of times when we're either disagreeing on something or angry about something, it's, what if I just stopped and understood, like, what this person is coming through or what is driving that? So much of anger is, like, say it's an emotion, but underneath anger, like, something's triggering it. It could be pride, it could be fear. It's like, what's causing us to, spew out hate against our neighbor, right? Like, whether it's a neighbor that is in our family or somebody, an abuser across town, and, we're still called to visit them in prison and to love others. Like, it is God's wrath and justice that will take care of everything else. It's just up to us to kind of get on a level playing ground. And again, that, Stephen will tell me, like, oh, you're so naive. You think, it's just this happy-go-lucky world, and if everyone just loved each other, we'd be okay. And I was like, no, absolutely not. I don't think we shouldn't have, a justice system in place, but I think it should be considering where people came from. Like you said, what if we took a step back and actually looked at what's causing this to continue? Could we actually change it then and care for it? And that's what we're called to do as believers and as a church. And you want to talk about, like, you know, the church revolution, like what would it look like if the church loved its neighbor without, like, accusing its neighbor or judging its neighbor because it looked different than us? And, like, what would that do for social justice in America as well as nationally?
For sure. Wow. All right, I'll get you out of here on this question.
Yeah.
It's not as much related to maybe your work, but maybe it is, and I just don't know. So there is a crisis. I don't know if it's necessarily considered a refugee crisis. I think it's more of an asylum seeker crisis at our border. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong on that. And definitely immigration to people seeking immigration. But I feel like the primary issue is asylum seekers. Is that fair? Or at least what's been the influx at the southern border has been asylum seekers?
Yeah. At the southern border, definitely it's that asylum seeker or somebody seeking asylum. And then also definitely, like, the immigration issue and what that looks like. So that's a big piece of it.
What are your thoughts on that, I guess? Or maybe are you connected to that work at all? Or are you, I know in my experience, a lot of social workers are connected through, you know, organizations crossing one another and such. I'm sure you're connected to people who are connected to that work or doing that work. Is it as bad as some of us have been told it is, in families being separated, and in some of the images that we've seen, pictures of you know, kids in, you know, chain link fences, cages, whatever you want to call them, however you want to, you know, determine that to be called, holding places. It seems like we weren't adequately prepared for the influx of asylum seekers. And to a certain extent, I have understanding and compassion on our system for that.
Yeah.
But it also doesn't necessarily seem like, from my perspective and from some of the people I've talked to who have actually went there or been there, that that we're taking the adequate steps to remedy the fact that we weren't prepared. I don't know. Tell me where I'm wrong. Tell me where I'm right. Tell me what I maybe need to know, or anyone else what they need to know.
Yeah. So at my agency, we, again, like, serve domestically, whatever that looks like. You know, people in poverty here in America. It could be people experiencing homelessness. It could be, you know, addiction. It could be veterans needing help, single moms, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a refugee, and then we also, the other side of it is we do immigration. And so definitely have the firsthand knowledge of the immigration side. And so I spent, 2 summers ago, I was down actually on the border, the Texas and Mexico border, and I got to work with some of the agencies that were actually, you know, receiving people directly out of ICE. And so I spent a week there helping people that were being released by ICE, that were awaiting their child now in the United States to be declared whether or not they, you know, would be allowed to stay here in America or have to be deported back home. So, you know, I've seen the places where they're holding people, and yeah, it's rough. You know, you get there and it's ironic. I landed and I walked out into McAllen, Texas, and you look around and they're country clubs. It looks like downtown area, and then tucked away in this little pocket right next to all the bars where people are going out on, you know, weekend nights, is a shelter for the people that are being released by ICE. And, you know, that organization is stepping up, and it's doing a lot. It's helping a lot. But again, that's a private organization who had to say the government's response is not adequate enough. It's not helping. And you see kids, again, parents with these kids just coming off of these ICE detention vans, getting dropped off at a bus station, and, you know, being told, this is a piece of paper and it has your court hearing date, and if you better get there. Surprisingly, and something I didn't know even, was people being released to wait in the country for their hearing. They have ankle monitors on, And so I can track them and see and know that they're not, sneaking off and staying illegally in the country then, because they are actually being monitored and have this device on them.
Okay.
And so that's, women, men. It's a lot of overcrowding, as many news reports have come out, and we've seen that. And so because of the overcrowding, people have been identified to have a connection, a legitimate connection here in the United States. It could be a family, it could be, a relative, and that person has been contacted and agreed to house this person who has come through the border and has been, housed by or being detained by ICE. And so they will release them and say, good luck. You're at a bus stop. Now figure out, navigate the American transportation system, and hopefully you can get from, the south border of Texas up to Rhode Island. And you have to get there, before your hearing date. And hopefully you can do that. And, we have kids that are coming across, and it's like they don't have anybody telling them how to navigate a bus system or even how to buy a bus ticket and to get across. And it's a mess. I've met buses of people getting released again from the ICE detention center or kind of lockdown facility, and they come out and they are wearing the same clothes that they have been wearing for the entire, month journey that it took, or however long, to get from one place up through the border. And they're in the same clothes. They've not showered. They've been detained for, a week or so. And when they come off that bus and you get to greet them, even just with a smile, I've had, people just stop and say, like, this is the first smile I've seen since I got here. Like, thank you. And thank you for just saying hello. This is the first time somebody said hello. And it's like, regardless of your stance on immigration, like, these people are people. Like, you greet someone with a smile and you say hello to someone. Like, that is, what value are we placing on someone's life that you can't even greet them, right? Like, that's just a sad reality for a lot of these people. And again, the torture and treacherous journey they've been on to even get up there. It's sad. And they, they come and organizations are greeting them and, kind of helping them assist with, like, okay, let's get your bus ticket. Let's do this. And, it's 365 days a year, and it's not just, 10 or 15 people getting released. It's hundreds a day that are coming to this organization and, trying to navigate how they're going to get to their court hearing. And we know that, it's about 90% of them will be deported back. And that's a reality that people know coming here. And that's how bad it is in other places right now, that they know they could die on the journey here. There is rape, there is torture, there is kidnapping, and yet they know there's still a 90% chance that even if they got here, they're most likely going to be sent back. And they've lost all their money and life getting here, and it's still worth that 10% chance, like, just to maybe potentially happen.
Wow.
And so, like, that to me is, like, that says a lot about, what is going on and the reality. And people say, well, they're just crossing because then they can just sneak in. And it's like, most people, once they get across the border, you have to be in America to declare asylum, like that you're seeking asylum status. And so, prior to a few different policies that were put in place, people would say, like, well, they're just coming here. And it's like, well, they legally have to enter the country to declare the status for the process to begin. And so in order to even have the chance at a court hearing, you have to turn yourself into ICE. And so people are not hiding and sneaking and running away. The majority of people are going to an ICE agent and saying, please take me in to a detention center. Please take me so I can start this process. And so it's not necessarily just, people crossing a river and running for it. There's a lot more intricacy, and, the conditions that these people are staying in. My last day down there, we had a girl, she's a 1-year-old, and her dad was there, and he had his 2-year-old son, and his wife had been kidnapped back home. And then when she was released, they killed her in front of the family. And it was, just this trauma knowing that this family had witnessed. And so they made it here on the journey. They were being released to go join their family until their court hearing. And this little girl was shivering. And it's, Texas summer. It's very well over 100 degrees. And we're like, why is this girl shivering? And it turned out she had allergies while she was in the detention center, and they did not treat her for just simple allergies, that she was losing consciousness, and we had to rush her to the hospital. And by the time they got her there, it was like life or death of, a couple more hours, and this girl would have died because of something that Claritin could have treated, or, infant Benadryl. And it's like, there's just so much. And again, who do you blame? The policymakers, the other countries, or, our immigration, officers? And it's like, it's kind of all mixed in there of, these other countries are causing some of this through corruption. And so what do you do about that? Is it our place to intervene? But then also, our immigration process has to get fixed too, because, the other side of the immigration process is we're still processing people's, visas applications from Mexico in the 90s today. They're just getting called up. And so what does that mean for our immigration process of people who are doing it, the authorized way of going through and applying? It's, what happens, and your life is being threatened. And so they've changed some of the policies where, you have to either be held in Mexico while you're waiting to cross the border for asylum status, or you have to be denied asylee status from other countries surrounding it as you work up here. But, people are still running for their lives, and just because you leave one country, that's a little bit worse for the other one. How much better off are you there? And what is that country doing to assist you? And again, it's not America's burden to be the answer and, again, the savior of all people, but it's like, well, what are we doing then for those that we can't save and can't help? How are we advocating or supporting?
Well, what are some of the unforced errors? Like, not giving a kid Benadryl, to me, it comes down to the sports analogy of an unforced error. It's one thing if the circumstance is just so great that, like, wow, this is going to be a hard one to draw up a play for. Does that make sense? But it's like, if you hike the ball and fumble it, okay, well, now you just totally screwed yourself. Like, pick up the ball. Like, don't fumble the ball. Like, to me, not giving an infant Benadryl, like, that's an unforced error. Like, that's just there's easy solutions, and maybe I'm ignorant of those solutions, but it would seem to me there's some solutions there, whereas this is definitely a complex issue. It's not a one, there's not a magic, bullet to just fix it all. You know what I mean? Or, a one answer, one size fits all answer. But, okay. So here's the deal. I have like 100 follow-ups to what you just said, but we need to end it here. So maybe next time I'll have you on if you're open to coming back, and we can talk strictly about the border, because I do think some people have a very particular way of seeing that, and that might be helpful to kind of expand what's happening in that particular realm. And I'm sure it's changing, and there's different realities too. So yeah, does that sound good? Okay. Yeah. Shannon, thank you for being on. You were great. This was a great conversation. I'm so glad I reached out to you. And
absolutely.
May God bless you in your work, and stay strong on the tough days. Stay strong, because I think what you're doing is really meaningful, and it matters for so many people. And I know I appreciate what you're doing, and so many others do. So thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And also, again, CFC was an interesting place, and a lot of the stuff that happened there. But when I look back and get to look at things that have happened and throughout high school and stuff, and just being a lot of just the lesson there of, like, it doesn't necessarily have to be the quantity of people we are converting or chasing after or bringing to events, or how flashy it is, but it's just like this bottom line fairness of, like, the gospel in action. And just that's something that I learned from you, from Brittany, and from your guys' time there. So I appreciate what you guys are doing. So, and you guys definitely left an impact years later still on me. So
well, I'm honored that I had a partial impact. Brittany probably had more than I did, though, to be honest. Just so you know, if you're listening, we're referencing my wife, Brittany. So, yeah, those who don't know. But, well, Shannon, you have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk to you later.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Well, there you have it. Another episode in the books. I'm so thankful to Shannon Rosedale for being on with me. We will definitely do that again and go deeper, because I'm sure while I was even talking, you had like all kinds of questions, things we could have gone deeper on. And we, I think, need to have a deeper conversation about the immigration process at the border and some of her knowledge in that. I would love to learn some more about that. So hopefully I'll get Shannon back on here soon. But big thanks to her, and so excited that you could join me for this episode of the podcast. Also, just so you know, I have a Patreon page. It's patreon.com/Beyond Boundaries podcast. Would love for you to help out financially if that's something you're able to do. And if not, everyone is able to hit the like button, the subscribe button, rate it, review it, send it to your friends, get people talking about it, you know, all that stuff. So if you're able to do that, go out and do that. Getting the word out makes a huge difference. If you'd like to find the show notes for this episode, you can go to pastorjustindouglas.com. May you go and live a life that is beyond boundaries, giving others love, exploring new ideas, and championing belonging.